Good morning again. It's good to be with you. For those of you at home, we are adjusting a new system, so I hope the sound improves. We're adding technology that the design of which is to improve the sound. You know how technology goes. Sometimes it doesn't work initially exactly as you imagine. If you recall, in Advent, I spent almost every Sunday of Advent talking about lamentation. Lamentation as an exercise of preparation for the revelation of the mystery of God that was approaching with Christmas. And that lamentation is an exercise that in a way precedes confession and absolution and those things. Let me remind you of it. Lamentation is that moment when we acknowledge whatever it was that I did, or what I was thinking, or what position I took, or whatever it might be, that there was something wrong with it, that it was an error. I can't confess to wrongness if I don't acknowledge that wrongness exists. So lamentation is that moment when I acknowledge wrongness exists and I feel contrite. I feel like I need to change, that I need to transform. And in our faith tradition, we talk about that next step being confession, forgiveness, and metanoia, the turning of my heart from the way I was going to a new way. I've been thinking a lot about lamentations lately as we live in a complicated and stressful time. If the normal circumstances of life weren't enough, we had COVID came along, and then we have the problems in culture and society with assault on one another, and injury, and police violence, and civilian violence, and all of those things going on, and protesting, which is a wonderful part of our tradition, but is not without stress. And if that all weren't enough, apparently the desert sands of the Sierra blew over us yesterday, just to add a little bit of aggravation to our sinuses, I guess. But in the midst of all that, I have been reflecting on my own life and on the circumstances of my life. In my home state, Mississippi, just yesterday, the state legislature passed a resolution removing the state flag, doing away with the stars and bars and coming up with a new state flag. That was something that I was involved in advocating 21 years ago, 19 years ago, when it came up in our state last time. And I felt strongly about it and continue to feel strongly about it. But there's a part of lamentation that a culture and society has to go through to get to that point. I've been thinking about it in the context of our religious tradition and the lamentation, particularly we see in the stories of the Old Testament, where the people fell away from righteousness. God's people fell away from righteousness in relationship with God, and sometimes in decades, even centuries, in a broken relationship with God because they did not acknowledge that anything was broken. They thought everything was just the way it ought to be. Only when finally the prophetic word caused lamentation were they able to see the transformation, metanoia, the turning of the heart. The whole story of the revelation of God in the person of Jesus is a story of God recognizing that there is a challenge in the human condition about our capacity to lament, to acknowledge our wrongness, and to enter into a process that leads us to metanoia. So, in the words of Martin Luther, in the revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, Our salvation is by God's grace through our faith in the mystery of God's revelation in the person of Jesus Christ. For some, this might suggest that, well, we don't have to worry about lamentation anymore. The lesson today talks about that. Well, should I just go ahead and sin, and what's the problem? And Paul says, no. It's a high calling. Even though we have salvation by grace through faith, there is a high calling to live out our faith in relationship to God and one another in a way that reflects the grace, love, and mercy of God and the expectation of our transformation, our metanoia. So I should always be involved in the process of self-reflection. Or we as a culture should always be in the process of self-reflection. What are those things we ought to lament? What are the sources of brokenness in our culture for which there is need for lamentation so that we can confess and seek that metanoia, that transformation of the heart? There is a 18th century philosopher that I read quite a bit, and because I'm in the pulpit, I get to impose upon you some of my peculiarities. And one of those is reading an 18th century philosopher named Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher. I find him very interesting. And the book you may know by him, his most famous, is The Wealth of Nations. But before he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1770, or released in 1776, in the 1750s he wrote a book called The Moral Sentiments. And in the Moral Sentiments he talked about empathy. And I think in order for me to embark upon a process of lamentation and metanoia, I have to understand what it means to be empathetic as a human being. I have to understand what it means to look outside of myself and see humanity as a co-equal. All of humanity and each individual other in humanity. Smith in Moral Sentiments said this is going to be a challenge because we are naturally, by inclination, self-centered. And we have to be trained to give up that self-centeredness in order to allow ourselves to be fellow-feeling. He described it as fellow-feeling oriented. That I'm willing to acknowledge the feelings of the other, and in acknowledging those, let go of my own self-centeredness, what we might call even my selfishness, in order to understand the call to transformation. In order to do this, Smith postulated two things. He said, one, we have to be willing to either observe the travails of another and imagine how I would experience it. I have to be willing to acknowledge the real travails, the real pain and suffering of another, and then imagine how I might experience that and how I might handle those travails and difficulties and challenges and injuries and hurts. In contrast to that, he said sometimes it's not enough just to imagine the travails of another and wonder how I would respond. Sometimes I need to embrace the fullness of the situation of the other and seek to experience their life from their point of view. That's a challenging exercise. To let go of self and to look into the life of another who's suffering and try to imagine the experience from their point of view and engage the feelings from their point of view. That's a real challenge. But by going through those kinds of exercises, Smith suggested that we could engage fellow feeling, or what we might today call empathy, in such a way that we can acknowledge our own possible contribution to the travails, challenges, and difficulties of another. And that in acknowledging those, we might discover a calling to lament those things. For what Smith suggested, and he was using child rearing as an example of this, as a child grows up and they let go of their sort of selfishness, they begin to recognize that there are other people in the world, and they might need to share. My grandson Guyton and my granddaughter Leona are together this week in Tacoma, Washington. And Guyton, who is fast approaching 2, and Leona, who is about 5 months old, Leona sees all these toys and she starts grabbing for them. And Guyton sees her grabbing for them and he starts gathering them all up and putting them away so she can't get them. They're his toys, and he doesn't want to share them. But through a process, we all know, we will teach sharing is a good thing. Sharing, Smith suggests, leads us to acquire moral conscience, that we understand there are others who have needs too, and there are others who might be hurting when we're not hurting. And it inspires us to develop a moral conscience. And out of this moral conscience, we can engage in this exercise of fellow feeling. But Smith acknowledges a challenge in that. He says that all of us grow up in a particular cultural environment, and that we are guided by socio-cultural rules in our home and in our communities and in our societies. And those socio-cultural rules begin to develop prejudices and biases and narrow-mindedness in our societies. And he says that those create difficulties because it makes it tough for us to attain the fullness of this call to fellow feeling, to these sacred rules of justice that he talked about, of not harming others and being respectful of others and upholding our obligations to one another in the totality of humanity. The foundation of the social justice notion he had was that we have to recognize the equality of every other human being. Smith was not necessarily the most religious fellow in Scotland, but he did have some sense of that created order, that God created the whole of creation. Therefore, all was good. So the way we deal with this, Smith suggests, is and for those of you who may know Smith's economic theory, this will sound familiar. We have to imagine an impartial spectator who's watching over us. And that impartial spectator is making judgments of how we're doing. So we want to make sure that impartial spectator recognizes that we're seeking to let go of some of these prejudices and biases that are a part of all human experience in order that we can more closely aspire to the fullness of our moral conscience, which is to care and protect and be just to every other human being. The moral spectator, or the impartial spectator, is one who's watching over and judging. And it's there that religion, our Christian, Judeo-Christian, Islamic tradition, comes to play, because we talk about that in this tradition. I remember Bette Midler years ago. Do you remember the song, God is Watching Us? But not in that instance, Midler was right. Not so much to judge us, but to see what we're going to do. How are we going to negotiate this? That's the idea of the impartial spectator, watching over. But in our instance, the impartial spectator breaks into time in the incarnation, in the revelation of God through Jesus Christ. The impartial spectator God decides to become incarnate so that we might have some catalyst to help us move in the direction of this high calling to justice and morality among us all that we share between one another. And that incarnation had a message for us. And the message for us, over and over again, whether you read in the Gospels or you read in the Epistles or the Pauline collection of letters or James or any of the other lesser epistles that are known, there's a recurring theme. There's a new commandment I teach you. Love. 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 As you seek to discover the fullness of the sacred rules of God's justice in the world, of justice in the world, love. If it doesn't resonate with love, go back inside of yourself and find out where you need to let go of something, where you need to lament some brokenness. If it doesn't harmonize with love, go back inside yourself and discover what you need to tweak in order to more fully realize the harmony of God's love. Love. The presiding bishop, who I hope many of you got to watch his interview, and the following, the Saturday before that, he was a part of a national march on, a digital march on Washington, a campaign for justice. And he talked about this there. But in the interview I did and in the interview he did on that, he repeatedly talked about love. Love is, for us, in a way, the intermediary in our time between that impartial spectator, God, if you will, and the transformative power of God in us. God revealed in the incarnation the power of love to transform, to metanoia, to turn our hearts, and to allow us to love one another, even as God loves us. So whether it's through secular ethics, particularly the sort of Adam Smith, one of my great heroes of ethical inquiry, or in addition to a powerful witness in our tradition, which is obviously of great importance to me, no matter how we look, we're called to explore this idea of fellow feeling. How we respond empathetically to the other, to pursue the sacred idea of justice in relationship with all of God's creation. But that brings me back to that series of sermons in Advent. I can't begin the process of love until I engage in the reflective endeavor to lament. And I can't begin to lament until I honestly look inside myself and say, where am I wrong? Where have I allowed my own prejudices, or my own sinfulness, or my own brokenness, or as C.S. Lewis would call it, my own bentness? Where have I allowed it to distract me from this journey of love to which God calls me and God calls you in this life we lead? I have to acknowledge those things so that I can lament those things and that I can begin to experience the power of metanoia, transformation in my life. That my heart can be turned and I can more clearly see the brilliant light of Christ burning all around me. So I began with lamentation, and today I will end with lamentation. But in the middle of all that, I hope that you hear that the calling is to grace, hope, mercy, and most importantly,